So this third lecture focuses on girls, and specifically girls' rights against gestational labor. In June 2022, the United States Supreme Court issued its Dobbs judgment. That judgment overturned Roe v. Wade from 1973, which recognized a constitutional right to abortion care. In the same month that Dobbs was issued, a child abuse doctor in Ohio discovered that a 10-year-old patient needed an abortion. She had been raped and impregnated by a 27-year-old man, Gerson Fuentes, when she was 9 years old. And she couldn't receive an abortion in Ohio because Ohio had a trigger ban ready to go. And as soon as the Dobbs judgment was issued, abortion after 6 weeks of pregnancy was illegal in Ohio. And so the doctor referred her to an Indiana OBGYN, Dr. Caitlin Bernard, who provided a medical abortion. Dr. Bernard then made a public statement about the case to the Indianapolis Star newspaper, and that ignited a political backlash that required her to hire 24-hour security. Several Republican politicians attacked her credibility. Congressman Jim Jordan accused her of lying. The Attorney General of Indiana, Todd Rokita, accused her of politicizing the 10-year-old, quote, for the gain of killing more babies, unquote. And Rokita launched an investigation into her conduct. In the court hearing on her conduct, Dr. Bernard showed a clear grasp of her patient's position, whose anonymity she did not breach. Quote, I did say the patient had been raped. That is how a 10-year-old becomes pregnant, unquote. That 10-year-old is one of many girls in America who have become casualties in the ongoing battle for control over female bodies. The overturning of Roe v. Wade marked, as Lieutenant Governor of New York Antonio Delgado put it, a reassertion of, quote, a social order grounded in patriarchy and male dominance over a woman's body, unquote. And I would add, dominance over a girl's body too. In Lecture 1, I argued that men's inability to gestate and their consequent dependency on women for parenting and reproductive opportunities brings profound disadvantages to men due to this difference in bodily ability. I noted the negative impact this disability can have on men's preferences, prompting some men to dismiss the value of engaged fathering, and prompting other men and women to inflict innumerable injustices on women and on girls in an unacknowledged effort to counteract that dependency. Female genital mutilation, intimate partner violence, marital rape, femicide, abortion bans, contraception bans, and even the representation of gestation as passive housing can all be viewed as part of an effort to counteract that dependency. In an article published this month, Ritu Sharma and Sushruth Ravish scrutinized the epistemic harms of marital rape, a topic that is not discussed enough in philosophy, arguing that marital rape can erode epistemic self-trust and diminish a victim's ability to register harm as experientially significant, thereby enabling patterns of abuse to continue. Some of patriarchy's worst excesses pertain to girls. They include permitting girls to gestate, pressuring girls to gestate, and worst of all, compelling girls to gestate. One worrying implication of the view that women have a duty to gestate for population-sustaining reasons, which I discussed in Lecture 2, one worry about that duty is that if women successfully insist upon their categorical right not to gestate, patriarchal societies will impose that duty on girls. More children are raped by someone than we might imagine, and the majority of these child victims are girls. UNICEF reported in October 2024 that more than 370 million girls are raped or sexually assaulted by someone before they turn 18. Over 90% of victims of sexual assault are female, and over 90% of the people who commit sexual assault are male. In addition, more children are impregnated by someone than we might suppose. UNICEF reports that in 2025, an estimated 325,000 girls between the ages of 10 and 14 birth a baby, and an estimated 12 million between the ages of 15 and 19 will birth a baby. According to UNICEF, in 2023, globally, an estimated 13% of girls birth a baby before they turn 18, with the highest rate occurring in sub-Saharan Africa, where 25% of girls birth a baby before they turn 18. Those numbers, while startling, actually represent a drop in the rates of child gestation over the past 30 years. In the United States, in 2022, close to 2,000 girls between 10 and 14 birthed a baby. And for 15 to 19-year-olds, over 143,000 girls birthed a baby, with 35,000 of those being girls between 15 and 17. Those numbers are actually too low, they're incomplete, because states like California, New Hampshire, and Maryland did not provide data, and they provide about 20% of abortion services and pregnancy services for teens in the US. Those numbers also do not include impregnations that resulted in miscarriage. And the numbers obscure the true youth and acute vulnerability of impregnated children. The youngest child on record to birth a baby in the United States was a 9-year-old girl named Estelle, who had started to menstruate at the age of 1. One of the youngest children on record in the UK to birth a baby is Tressa Middleton, who wrote a memoir about her experience. She was raped by her brother and then birthed a baby at age 12 in 2006. It appears that an even younger girl in the UK was impregnated at age 10 and birthed a baby at age 11 in 2021. And I say apparently because the reports on that, it was difficult to verify them. The youngest girl in the world to birth a baby was a little girl named Lina Medina in Peru, and she was 5. Being sexually assaulted in childhood tends to trigger an earlier onset of puberty, about 1.5 to 2 years earlier than in non-assaulted peers. We may speculate that girls who are impregnated by someone at a very young age, 10, 11, sometimes 9, they may well have been sexually assaulted prior to that. And that prior assault or assaults triggered the early onset of puberty, which then rendered them impregnable. When an adult or a youth molests a prepubescent girl, they not only violate and traumatize her, they rob her of her prepubescence, forcing early sexual maturation and heightening her exposure to the risks of impregnation, gestation, birthing, mothering, and further sexual assault. Women who are assaulted in childhood are more likely to be assaulted again as adults. The fact that sexual assault of a young girl tends to trigger the early onset of puberty underscores that this kind of assault differs radically from the assault of an adult victim. And it is the adult victim, the adult woman, that philosophers tend to focus on. The child's forced pubertal metamorphosis, when experienced so young, renders her profoundly vulnerable. It also presents a chimera of maturity. The visible signs of puberty trick the eye and then trick the mind into classifying her differently from other children. And so sexual assault of a girl is, among other things, an attempt to womanize her. And those realities should be front and center in our analysis of why rape of a girl is egregiously wrong. In collaboration with some of my doctoral students, Alyssa Izat, Ashley Lindsley Kim, and Kalita Kang, I'm exploring the significance of forced sexual maturation in an analysis of girl rape, and Kalita's taking the lead on that research. In this final lecture, I will take as my starting point a position that I've developed with Alyssa Izat, that abortion care is a necessary part of adequate medical care for an impregnated child. In a forthcoming article titled Justice for Girls, Alyssa and I argue that both opponents of abortion and liberal defenders of women's rights to control their own body make a mistake in relation to children. They both overlook that an impregnated child is a child. As a child, she should never be compelled to gestate. Equally, she should never be presented with the three options of giving a baby up for adoption, having an abortion, or trying to mother. And yet that is what medical associations presently advise doctors to do, to present a child with those three options. Alyssa and I argue that instead, a child's adult caregivers have a duty to view her impregnation as a malady and to take steps to terminate it. To defend this view, we draw an analogy with living child organ donation. Children are protected from engaging in the life-sustaining effort of donating an organ because children have rights to be protected from exploitation and protected from bearing undue burdens relative to their age, competence, and experience, even if some good could come about from them doing so. In rare exceptions, adult caregivers might be permitted to allow an older child, a 16 or 17-year-old, to donate to an immediate family member, provided that, first, the donation is a last resort, so no cadaver match or adult match could be found. Second, the donation is low risk for the donor. Third, the donor is not coerced or manipulated. And fourth, the donation is actually in her own best interests. So this might be her caregiver, and saving her caregiver could be beneficial for her. For similar reasons, we argue, children should be protected from the risky, life-cultivating work of gestating. All children, regardless of their cognitive competence or their physical development, have a right to a certain number of years protected from the burdens of adulthood. All children have a right to a childhood. And so for an impregnated child, this means, first, regardless of her stage of pregnancy, she has a right to an abortion. Second, her present well-being, her future well-being, and her overall best interests take priority, and those are best served by providing an abortion. Third, medical professionals would be failing her if they withheld abortion care, even if they did so because she was averse to receiving it. So we argue medical professionals should adopt a uniform protocol to provide abortion care to impregnated children. Put simply, when it comes to children, we should not be pro-life or pro-choice. We should be pro-abortion. In our presentation of this argument, Alyssa and I adopt a paradigm case approach to the specification of who is a child. We allow that some people who are just shy of 18 might deserve to be viewed as adults. However, we say that the test doctors should follow is whether they would view this patient as a child in another medical context. Would they provide her cancer treatment in her best interests? Would they provide a blood transfusion in her best interest, even if it was against her wishes? If they would view her as a child in those other medical contexts, they should view her as a child in the case of gestation. And we should not mythologize gestation or deny girls the protections of childhood. The neglect of girls' concerns within reproductive ethics is part of a broader pattern of neglect of girls within feminism, and a pattern of injustice toward girls as girls. So in new research with Ashley Lindsley Kim and Alyssa Izad, I am scrutinizing the nature and severity of what we are calling anti-girlism, which is injustice toward girls as girls. And we've isolated so far 4 distinct types of anti-girlism. The first one is adultification, which involves treating a child like an adult, assigning to her adult-like responsibilities and adult accountability. And we note that adultification tends to be gendered. So girls tend to be adultified into caregiving roles, boys tend to be adultified into aggressive roles like soldiering. A second type of anti-girlism is womanization, and that involves drawing a false equivalence between girls and women, which is what happens under abortion bans. So the Alabama abortion ban is wholly unapologetic about this. It says, for the purposes of this law, a woman is any female human being, regardless of whether she has reached the age of majority. The third type of anti-girlism is erasure or juvenile genericism. And this involves subsuming girls under a generic heading of child or youth. Now, the term child is genuinely neutral, but the term youth has masculine connotations. And when we apply it to practices in sport or practices in academic achievement, we have a male-centered vision of what youths engage in and how youths perform well. And then the final type of anti-girlism we identify is targeting. And this involves actively stereotyping, discriminating against, abusing, or otherwise mistreating girls in virtue of their girlhood. Sex-selective abortions are overwhelmingly performed on female fetuses. Rates of poverty, malnutrition, early death, poor education, sexual violence, child marriage, prostitution, and trafficking, all of that is inflicted far more often on girls than on boys. What we are discovering in developing an account of anti-girlism is that feminism seems to have missed something. Feminist philosophy professes to be more sensitive, more unbiased, more inclusive in its approach to ethics and politics than traditional philosophical approaches are. And yet feminism has singularly failed to distinguish girls' concerns from women's concerns. Feminist philosophers routinely refer to women and girls in the same breath, but girls deserve their own bespoke analysis. And so the treatment of child gestation in comparison with child organ donation is a first step toward providing that bespoke analysis, at least in the context of reproductive ethics. What I aim to do now is to set aside that analogy and consider a different analogy that takes a second step. And that second analogy compares child gestation with child labor. As I highlighted in lecture 2, gestating involves 9 months of high-risk, energetically demanding, arduous, creative labor. And as such, an analogy with child labor is as apt as a medical analogy such as organ donation. I will argue that child gestation has similar features to the worst kinds of child labor. It is dangerous, traumatic, harmful to a child's development. Indeed, a labor-centered analogy reveals features of child gestation which an organ donation analogy does not reveal. Namely, that gestating is debasing to a child. The analogy with insidious child labor supports a more radical conclusion about gestation than that doctors should adopt a uniform protocol to provide abortion care to children. This labor-centered analogy supports the conclusion that child gestation should be eradicated. Okay. So the first step is to specify the worst forms of child labor. UNICEF defines child labor as, quote, work that children are too young to perform, or that by its nature or circumstances can be hazardous. Unlike activities that help children to develop, such as contributing to light housework or taking on a job during school holidays, child labor causes harm to a child's health, safety, or moral development, unquote. Now, the term worst forms of child labor is a technical term which the International Labor Organization uses to identify those forms of child labor that should be eradicated with the greatest urgency. In 1999, the ILO adopted a convention on the worst forms of child labor. That convention states that a child is anyone under the age of 18, and it states that the worst forms of child labor are those insidious forms that, quote, expose children to physical danger or profound psychological trauma that can affect them for life. The worst forms of child labor include slavery and similar practices, such as child trafficking, child prostitution and pornography, illicit activities such as the use of children in drug trafficking, and hazardous work which is likely to harm their health, safety, or morals, unquote. Now, that final category, hazardous work, is characterized more fully as, quote, work that by its nature or circumstances is likely to harm health, safety, or moral development. This includes anything that exposes children to physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, work that occurs underground, underwater, at treacherous heights, or in confined spaces, often with dangerous machinery, equipment, or tools, work in an unhealthy environment where children are exposed to hazardous substances or processes, extreme temperatures or noise level, work that's particularly difficult in conditions like laboring for long hours or overnight, unquote. Now, the convention highlights the need to remove children from the worst forms of child labor, to provide for their rehabilitation and social integration while addressing the needs of their families. It also stresses that to a great extent, child labor is caused by poverty. Now, what's really interesting is that this convention achieved universal ratification. 187 ILO member states, every ILO member state ratified it by 2020. And that was a historical first for the ILO, suggesting that there is universal recognition, international agreement on the necessity of eradicating the worst forms of child labor. Now, the objections against the worst forms include harm, bodily injury, mental injury, illness, exhaustion, death. Second, failure to benefit, so denying a child education, denying a child the freedoms of childhood. Third, debasement, such as through sex-related work. And fourth, exploitation, such as illegal work or compensable work that is done without compensation. Philip Cook has offered a really valuable analysis of these objections and of the difficulties of applying them in our very non-ideal world. But given children's physical, social, legal, and financial vulnerability, their relative incompetence, their lack of experience, and their subordinate position in relation to adults, they need to have strict protections that guard them from harmful and exploitative arrangements. On exploitation, John Stuart Mill aptly observes that for children, freedom of contract is freedom of coercion, the freedom to be coerced. The worst forms of child labor, many of them confront all of these objections. So sex work, for example, it is harmful, it fails to benefit the child, it is debasing, it is exploitative, it is often criminal, must be criminal. It robs children, usually girls, of a burden-free childhood. It denies them access to play, creativity, friendship, self-development. As Anke Gausch observes, there are many valuable activities that children excel at, which we struggle to engage in as adults unless we make a concerted effort. And the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child states that in view of their immaturity, they need special safeguards. They have a right to care, safety, and security, a right to be protected from exploitation, a right to develop healthily, and a right to be carefree, unburdened by big life and death decisions. Now, my claim is that those arguments against the worst forms of child labor can be applied to child gestation. So with respect to harm and the failure to benefit, as I noted in lecture 2, gestating in adulthood is a risky business. Gestating in childhood is even riskier. Maternal conditions are the second highest cause of death of 15 to 19-year-old girls worldwide. And maternal conditions are among the top 5 causes of disability-affected life years for that group. Gestating in childhood is also linked to a general risk of dying young, dying in your 30s for other reasons. Equally pressing are the ways gestating affects a child's body, mind, safety, social position, and future prospects. Impregnated children and older teenagers, 18, 19-year-olds, they have a greater risk of preeclampsia, anemia, rupture of the fetal membrane. They face a higher risk of adverse birth outcomes, including low fetal weight, preterm delivery, and neonatal death. Impregnated children face also adverse mental health outcomes, guilt, anxiety, depression, which can be a response to gestating itself and a response to the difficult decision a girl has to often make about whether to try to mother. Taking on the role of motherhood in adolescence is associated with poor mental health as well. The rates of depression alone are twice as high as those of adolescent girls who don't mother. Taking on mothering in adolescence has poor social outcomes. It's linked to rapid repeat pregnancies, having a greater number of children overall, lower levels of education, higher levels of poverty, greater risk of incarceration. And so the reasons related to equality of rights, that we support both our boys and our girls to develop healthily, that underscore how significant these poor social outcomes are for girls. Not all girls are equally vulnerable to these risks. Intersectionality looms large in girls' experiences, both in whether they will be impregnated in childhood and whether they'll receive abortion care. There is racism and classism in abortion bans. Affluent people can travel for care. Equally, there is racism and classism in cavalier approaches to girls' gestational labor. Anne Martin and Jean Brooks-Gunn observe that there is substantial variability in teenagers' birth rates according to demographics, suggesting that teenage gestation is more a function of social inequality than of preference. Focusing on the US, they write, quote, although the overall rate of teenage, 15 to 19, childbearing in 2012 was 29.4 per thousand, the rate was much higher for African Americans, 43.9 per thousand, and Hispanics, 46.3, than for non-Hispanic whites, 20.5. Teenagers whose families are poor, who live in single-parent households, whose mothers have less education, whose families earn less income, who have received welfare, who reside in socioeconomically depressed neighborhoods are all more likely than teenagers without those characteristics to become mothers before they reach their adult years. Now, regrettably, Martin and Brooks-Gunn womanize these girls. They refer to them more than once as teenage women. Both UNICEF and the WHO do the same thing. Their reports on 10 to 14-year-olds who have gestated talk about them as women. Nonetheless, the central point that child gestation is more a function of socioeconomic inequality than of preference will be worth remembering when we turn to Derek Parfit's case of the 14-year-old girl. The third argument against insidious child labor is debasement. Gestating is debasing to a child. It defiles, demeans, humiliates, shames, and exposes her. First, children come into the world innocent in two senses. They are not deliberate sources of injury to other people, and they are ignorant of the evils, brutalities, and atrocities that one human can inflict on another. An adult who rapes a child or sex traffics a child tears at that innocence, robbing her of a carefreeness to which she has a right as a child. Michelle Madendensi offers a forceful analysis of the arguments for criminalizing sex trafficking and prostitution for feminist abolitionist reasons. And many of those reasons are particularly pressing in relation to girls. The adult who rapes or traffics a girl treats as an object for disposal someone who is growing into a person and someone who will be profoundly shaped by that abuse. He forcibly accelerates her sexual maturation, as I noted, not only robbing her of her prepubescence, but rendering her vulnerable to impregnation and further assault. That forced acceleration then enables her society to place her in the same kind of extractive relation that it has with many women, extracting from her unpaid caregiving, domestic labor, gestating, and mothering, as well as underpaid conventional work. But it's not just rape, sex work, and trafficking that abuse and debase a child. It is also impregnation and the gestational labor a child must do unless she is relieved of it by more caring adults. Impregnating a child constitutes reproductive abuse. This reproductive abuse has two subcategories. The first is gestational abuse, which is forced or compulsory gestation, or equally, the necessity of having to seek abortion care to prevent it. And second, it includes prospective parenting abuse, forced parenting by a child, or a forced decision of whether to give a baby up for adoption. Reproductive abuse is distinct from sexual abuse. It is usually inflicted in the course of sexual abuse, but it need not be inflicted that way. Impregnating a child via IVF would also constitute reproductive abuse. Second, gestating is debasing to a child because it wrongly encumbers her and exposes her body. First, her body is ill-suited to gestation. She should never be pushed to an endurance maximum in an attempt to create a new being. She should never be stretched, full, heavy, weighed down in the particular way that distinguishes gestation. And she should never have to undertake the excruciating work of birthing a baby. In addition, her body should not have to be a visibly sexed body. Amy Mullen observes about adult women that, quote, during late pregnancy, a woman's sex is immediately obvious, even to strangers, and few of her interactions with strangers and casual acquaintances will be unaffected by social meanings given to sex and gender, unquote. In the final months of gestation, an impregnated girl's sex is also immediately obvious to strangers, but it is laden with much more weighty social meanings. Her body is exposed to onlookers as a sexualized body, one that has experienced either sex or sexual assault. And her body takes on that revealing shape of gestation, which steals her privacy and makes her an object of voyeurism, stigma, and shame. Given her youth, her body becomes unusual, startling, even aberrant as a double image of the juvenile and the maternal, the mature form transposed onto the immature frame, whose shorter stature and wide eyes convey how much the adults around her have betrayed her. Now, at this point, a critic might want to try to distinguish older adolescents from younger girls, arguing that 16 and 17-year-old girls, an idealized set of Juliets and their Romeos, should not be seen as debased by gestation. Instead, they are entitled to choose to get pregnant and to try to mother. I will discuss older teens more in a moment. For now, let me note that the International Labour Organization specifies a child to be anyone under the age of 18, and the ILO holds that insidious child labor should be eradicated for all children. And so the thought here is, to make it vivid, if sex work is debasing to 16 and 17-year-old girls, why would gestating not be? A state that compels child gestation under an abortion ban compounds the debasement of an impregnated child. A child whom someone has debased through rape and impregnation, or whose impregnation is entwined with her poor socioeconomic position, is then further debased by the society that forces her to bear the full costs of that impregnation, laboring through its effects for 9 months, if not in years of mothering afterward. That society forces her to risk her life, health, well-being, and future prospects in the most arduous endeavor the human body can withstand. To see the depravity of that imposition, note that most elite sports organizations won't let children under 16 compete. But by contrast, states like Alabama unabashedly force girls of any age to gestate. In those states, gestation amounts to forced or compulsory labor. Finally, child gestation is debasing because it warps a child's relationships within her family setting. Certain asymmetrical relationships typify a well-organized, well-ordered family, those between caring guardians and cared-for children, in contrast to other symmetrical or horizontal relations, such as those between siblings or ideally between spouses. When someone impregnates a child, he jolts her out of her position within her family. Is she still someone to be cared for, protected, and provided for, as children are? Or is she now among the family's caregivers, providers, and protectors? And her displacement is all the more extreme when the person who impregnated her is among her own caregivers. And the tragedy in these questions is magnified when they arise within the poorest families, where caregiving, protection, and provision for dependents are often difficult to secure. Okay, and then the final argument against insidious child labor, which I believe applies to child gestation, is that of exploitation. This argument applies both to abortion restrictive policies and to abortion permissive policies. Many girls live in permissive jurisdictions where physicians are guided to present a girl with all 3 options of abortion, adoption, or mothering, thereby requiring a child to confront the most momentous questions of adult responsibility. And this permissiveness puts a girl in a position that echoes Mill's observation about contracts. For a child, freedom of choice over gestation equates to freedom of coercion, the freedom to be coerced by family or a boyfriend to continue to gestate, the freedom to be roped into mothering too young, the freedom to be subsumed within family life, and the freedom to end up in poverty. An abortion prescriptive position better protects a child from exploitation. Now, strikingly, or perhaps not, no mention is made of gestational labor in the ILO's recommendations. But, by contrast, insidious forms of child labor that both boys and girls can perform, working in dangerous facilities with toxic substances, for example, those are mentioned explicitly in the ILO Convention. If child gestating was either overlooked or intentionally left out, we can condemn that disregard as anti-girlist, a disregard of a type of insidious child labor that only girls can undertake. We can also suspect that if gestation had been mentioned, the ILO would not have achieved universal ratification of its convention. Okay, so what would be the implications of seeing child gestation as akin to, if not a literal example of, insidious child labor? What would it mean to make it a priority to eradicate it? First, states must gather better data on child rape, impregnation, gestation, miscarriage, abortion, birthing, and mothering. The data are hard to collect. There are lots of gaps. It's very hard to find country-specific data on 10 to 14-year-olds, for example. Second, states must enact laws that positively protect girls from gestational labor. And a key reason for that is that many children are ill-informed. They are ill-informed about what causes impregnation, and they lack the freedoms to try to address their own healthcare needs. As such, they are likely to experience indirect discrimination when abortion laws restrict access to the first or even second trimester. They're going to find out later. They're going to have more difficulty accessing care. Those laws that seem supportive, first or second trimester limits, indirectly discriminate against girls. Third, states must prosecute people who seek to coerce a child to gestate. Fourth, states must recognize that impregnating a minor is a criminal offense in its own right. In most jurisdictions, it is not. It is represented as aggravating of sexual assault. Fifth, states must educate people about the laws protecting girls. Sixth, they must hold physicians accountable who would deny care to a gestating child. Seventh, international bodies must view female child sex work and pornography not only in terms of debasing and illegal prostitution, but also in terms of reproductive abuse and child gestation. Eighth, states should view the crimes of prostitution and sex trafficking of female children as aggravated by the risks of impregnation, gestating, birthing, and mothering. So in short, child gestation constitutes a gross injustice to girls, one that is equivalent to, if not a literal example of, insidious child labor. It also constitutes an intersectional injustice that disproportionately affects socially disadvantaged girls. And that reality about child gestating makes philosophers' treatment of adolescent gestators surprising and problematic. Alyssa Isaac and I discussed this briefly in Justice for Girls, and I'll elaborate our point here. So this is the philosopher's blind spot. In Reasons for Persons, Derek Parfit offers a now famous case of a 14-year-old girl who decides to have a baby. He writes, the 14-year-old girl chooses to have a child. Quote, because she is so young, she gives her child a bad start in life. Though this will have bad effects throughout the child's life, his life will predictably be worth living. If this girl had waited for several years, she would have had a different child to whom she would have given a better start in life, unquote. Although Parfit says the girl does not harm the baby by giving birth to him at the age of 14, Parfit does believe she acts wrongly, that she ought not to have conceived now, that she should probably feel some moral regret. Almost all respondents to Parfit agree with him the 14-year-old acts wrongly. With the exception of Bonnie Steinbach, who fully appreciates a 14-year-old's likely position, philosophers reserve all of their concern for the plight of the girl's baby. They do not question whether the girl actually makes a free and intentional choice, nor do they temper the language in which they judge her. They say her action reflects poorly on her character, shows the irrationality of her choice in terms of her own interests, creates burdens for society. Some say harms her baby, some say harms her baby unjustifiably, and thereby wrongs him. That is a long list of damning judgments to make against someone whom all philosophers agree is insufficiently mature to be a responsible parent. Philosophers who use the case do not dwell on the socioeconomically disadvantaged profile of the girls who tend to gestate, that if they might be said to have a preference, it is most likely an adaptive preference, a deformed desire about how to improve their situation. Philosophers also don't dwell on the fact that the most economically secure 14-year-old is legally, financially, and socially dependent on the adults around her. She's radically restricted in her control of her own life. She may not leave school, she may not live alone, she may not have a full-time job, she may not own property, she may not drive, she may not travel without a guardian's permission, she may not seek medical treatment without a guardian's involvement. More pertinently, she may not adopt a child, and she may not seek IVF treatment. And so she could not blithely declare about any of those activities, including gestating and mothering, that this is my affair. And that's because 14-year-olds are children. Their dependency is entwined with their security, safety, protection, and well-being. And most importantly for this case, the 14-year-old is not a fully morally responsible agent. And so ultimately, the thought experiment turns on an incompetence that must both be attributed to the girl in order to conclude that she'll be a bad parent, and denied to the girl in order to judge her as morally accountable. That is a kind of warped or two-faced adultification. And it's a form of adultification that comes in many contexts. A family engages in two-faced adultification when they decide their young daughter is old enough to marry and take on a wife's responsibilities, but then they make the choice for her because she's too immature to decide this for herself. A society engages in two-faced adultification when it frames the sexualization of young girls as empowering, but then tolerates predation because girls are unreliable testifiers about adults' behavior toward them due to their youth and inexperience. Likewise, a conservative religious community engages in two-faced adultification when it holds that young girls should not be having sex except within wedlock, but then it requires girls who do have sex or who have been raped to bear the full repercussions like adult women under an abortion ban. Each of those two-faced adultifications assigns competence to girls with one hand while denying it with the other hand, thereby capitalizing on girls' youth and relative incompetence to entrap them in adultified positions. Okay, let's look at some objections to what I've said. One objection to the specific analogy with child labor is that gestating is not an employment activity. Child labor, it occurs within a business, within an industry. There's an industry nature to the work, and that's absent from child gestation. And so even though many children who engage in child labor are not paid for their work, those who do labor within certain contexts, industry, business, employment. Their labor is transactional, and it's financially advantageous to those who employ them. By contrast, gestating occurs outside of an industry, except in surrogacy. It's not a matter of business, it's not transactional or financially advantageous to those who would compel girls to do it. So in reply, first, while many children perform insidious labor within recognized businesses and industry contexts, children need not do so for their work to be insidious labor. Any child who labors in hazardous ways, doing dangerous work, working for excessive hours, within the family setting, is engaging in insidious labor. Second, while child gestating may not be a recognized employment activity within an industry, though I suspect many girls do serve as surrogates, it is certainly an economic activity. For many girls who gestate, their labor is entwined with the financial concerns of their families or their employers or themselves. Girls who are prostituted or used in pornography face a live risk of impregnation. That's a live hazard, both in itself and as a risk to their continued work. Next, girls who are married off by their families, they experience something that is blurring the lines of family life and business. Marrying off a daughter can relieve financial pressure on a family that was maintaining her. It can sometimes improve their financial position, alliances, and social standing. Moreover, a girl herself might seek child marriage, gestational work, and mothering in an attempt to improve her situation, seeking a husband and a modicum of security, as well as the standing of a mother. Such efforts may be viewed in the same light as children laboring for money. Those efforts are transactional, they're often undertaken on terms amounting to servitude, and so the analogy with insidious child labor is apt, if it is an analogy at all. Another objection is that gestational labor is transformatively maturing, that girls who gestate are no longer children. I flagged before that UNICEF and the WHO and many academics speak about adolescent girls and younger children who gestate as women. The language reflects a seemingly widespread but misguided belief that gestating is a transformatively maturing experience, that by enduring the most arduous task the human body can undertake, often as a result of rape, a girl emerges as an adult capable of taking on the responsibilities of choosing whether to continue to gestate and subsequently choosing whether to mother. The two-part objection to my argument that child gestation should be eradicated would be, first, such an effort to eradicate it would infantilize young women who should be allowed to choose for themselves whether to continue their pregnancies. And second, this infantilization would add insult to injury. Girls who have been raped or who have otherwise become pregnant due to socioeconomic circumstances should not have adults making further impositions upon them, such as mandating abortion care, when they either oppose it or wish to continue to gestate. In reply, in reality, gestating in childhood does not transform girls into women, does not transform them psychologically, socially, legally, or morally. Although sexual abuse tends to prematurely age up a girl's body, in all other respects it compromises her development. Being impregnated and having to gestate are developmentally stunting experiences for the reasons I flagged above. Gestating is traumatic, risky, time-consuming, depleting, debasing, often reproductively abusive, hazardous to their development. It also compromises their growing personal identity. It robs girls of the final years of protected status as children, and girls have the same rights to a childhood that other children have. To see the force of the point, note that the preferences of children to engage in insidious labor are recognized as immaterial. The work is so awful for them, they should never be doing it, even if they wish to do so. Equally, returning to the organ donation analogy, the preference of a child to donate a non-regenerative organ or something else that would be high risk in order to save a loved one is recognized as immaterial. Children are protected. They are not permitted, let alone required, to engage in that kind of risky, life-saving effort. So too, the preferences of a child to gestate are immaterial. Even in our extremely non-ideal world, where some girls might seek to gestate as the lesser of all evils, they should not be permitted, left to do it, or forced to do it. If these arguments leave the critic unmoved, consider the following thought experiment. Suppose your 14-year-old son wants to amputate his left arm, and suppose your 14-year-old daughter wants to get pregnant. Which undertaking should you oppose more vigorously as a parent? I imagine the first impulse would be to say the amputation. But I believe a parent should be far more sanguine about a son amputating his arm than about a daughter gestating, birthing, and possibly mothering a baby. The amputation is far less risky or costly. It has far less of an impact on his future well-being than gestating has on hers. If we do have the intuition that a parent would and perhaps should more actively seek to prevent the amputation, I believe that reveals something about our attitudes toward gestating and girlhood. I think it suggests we have anti-girlist attitudes about gestating and childhood, which we should scrutinize, because every child, every girl has a right to a childhood. Okay, let me briefly tie up the threads of these 3 lectures. I have sketched out 3 profiles of reproductive rights. First, I have defended the rights of men to receive mitigation and accommodation from the state in an effort to lessen the impact of their gestational dependency. I've held that gestational dependency disadvantages men in profound ways, and it has dangers for women and for girls. Second, I've examined the rights of women to control their own gestational labor. I've argued that women have a categorical right to control that labor, even in the face of societal collapse or the threat of extinction. And finally, third, today I've explained why girls have a right to be protected from gestational circumstances and gestational labor in all circumstances because they are children. In sketching out these three profiles of reproductive rights, I've sought to intervene in a number of philosophical debates: the philosophy of disability, the nature of pregnancy, rights theory, population ethics, feminism, and the philosophy of childhood. I've also sought to identify some needed policy changes pertaining both to childhood impregnation and to male gestational dependency. And overall, I've argued that if we attend properly to the disadvantages experienced by people who cannot gestate, specifically the disadvantages experienced by men, which are entwined with patriarchy's worst excesses, then we might treat men more justly, and we might also recognize the gross injustices in our treatment of girls who gestate and in our judgment of women who do not. Thank you.